In a small town there are places that just feel like home. Not fancy, not modern, but the kind of place where the air smells like frying bacon and bad decisions. This was Williford, a quiet spot tucked right beside the wide, muddy sweep of the Mississippi River, and the heartbeat of its morning was the Riverside Diner. The diner wasn't much to look at: chipped red laminate counters, stools that spun a little too freely, and big windows that usually steamed up when the humidity hit. But the coffee was strong, the eggs were fluffy, and everyone knew everyone's order before they even sat down. Well, almost everyone. Hey there and welcome back. I'm so happy you're here. Grab that blanket, maybe pour yourself a hot drink and get really comfortable because today we're settling in for a story you won't forget. Before we dive any deeper though, let me know how you're doing. Drop a quick comment and tell me what part of the world you're watching from today. And if you want to stay with us through all the twists and turns ahead, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a moment. Alright, let's get back to it. This particular morning, the sun wasn't quite high enough to chase away the deep shadows, which suited Elena Ward just fine. At 24, Elena had the kind of genuine smile that could instantly brighten up the grimiest day, even if her own life was currently stuck on the grimy setting. She wore the standard diner uniform, a pale blue button-up shirt and a slightly too long apron, and moved with the tireless energy of someone working 2 jobs to keep her college classes paid for. Elena wasn't just a waitress, she was the silent observer of Williford. She knew that Mrs. Henderson ordered her toast dry and that young Billy from the garage always left a 15% tip, no matter how slow the service was. But for the last few weeks, all her attention had been laser-focused on one booth in the very back corner. The darkest booth, the one where the single tattered Venetian blind always seemed to stay half-closed. That booth belonged to the stranger. He didn't have a name, not one Elena knew, but he had a routine. He arrived exactly at 7:30 every morning, occupied the same booth and ordered the same thing: black coffee. That was it. No sugar, no cream, no eggs, no toast, no small talk. His silence was louder than the sizzling grill. The stranger was a man who moved like he was constantly ready to fight or run. He was maybe 39, but the exhaustion etched around his eyes made him look far older. He was lean, dressed simply in dark, unremarkable clothes. A plain gray t-shirt, a worn leather jacket always kept nearby. His hair was dark and neatly cut, but his stubble was always just long enough to look menacing. The thing that snagged Elena's focus, though, was his eyes. They were the color of cold, stormy water, and they never, ever looked at her. They scanned. They watched the door, the window, the reflection in the coffee pot. They were the eyes of a creature who expected a net to drop on him at any second. One morning, Elena tried to break the silence. She approached his table, refilled his cup. He never asked for a refill, but she did it anyway, and wiped a phantom crumb off the table. "Big storm coming," she offered, nodding toward the windows where the clouds were starting to turn a bruised purple. The stranger didn't look up. His voice, when it came, was a low, smooth rumble like an engine running quietly in the distance. "Just the usual." "Right," Elena said, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. It was a complete dismissal. She almost walked away, but the sheer weariness in his tone, it was too heavy for a simple diner customer. "You look tired," she blurted out, instantly regretting the unprofessional familiarity. This time his head lifted and those cold eyes finally locked onto hers. The intensity of his gaze was a physical weight, pressing the air out of her lungs. It wasn't hostility, though. It was a deep, bone-aching sadness that he tried desperately to hide. It was the look of a man who'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. "I am," he simply stated, and then he looked away, ending the conversation with the same sharp finality as a slammed door. Elena retreated to the counter, her heart beating a little faster. She sensed danger around him, no doubt. Anyone with half a brain could tell this man wasn't just on vacation. But beneath the danger she saw something else. A deep, profound loneliness. It was the kind of weariness you only got when someone had lived 100 lives too fast and paid for every single one of them. She felt a strange, protective flicker for this dangerous, silent man. Unbeknownst to Elena and everyone else in Williford, they were hosting a ghost. The stranger was actually Dominic Rourke, 39, the newly appointed underboss of the infamous Rourke Syndicate. The Rourke Syndicate was the kind of organized crime family whose names were whispered in hushed tones from the bustling ports of the UK to the high-rises of Toronto. Dominic had climbed the ranks quickly, earning his spot through ruthless efficiency and an unwavering code of loyalty. But loyalty, as he'd recently discovered, was just a word people used until the price was right. A carefully orchestrated betrayal from within his own ranks had forced him to vanish. He wasn't hiding from the police. He was hiding from his own people. The kind who didn't just want him dead, they wanted to make an example of him. He chose Williford precisely because it was so utterly forgettable. A small, quiet town in the middle of nowhere, perfect for a man who needed to disappear. Later that afternoon the diner quieted down. The lunch rush was over and Elena was wiping down the chrome counter. Dominic, still just the stranger to her, was the only customer left. He hadn't moved since 7:30 that morning, his fourth cup of black coffee cooling in front of him. He reached into his jacket pocket not for a wallet but for a worn, folded map. He glanced at it quickly, tracing a finger across a few lines, old shipping routes along the river, before slipping it away. He hated this. He hated waiting. Waiting was weakness. But he knew the rules of the hunt. The betrayed must become the ghost before he could become the predator again. Elena came over to collect his empty mug, her movement silent. "Anything else, sir?" He finally looked at her fully, and for a brief, startling moment the hardened mask slipped. She saw a flicker of something almost kind, almost grateful, before it was immediately replaced by the cold, calculating alertness she knew so well. "No," Dominic said, placing a $20 bill neatly on the table. A huge tip for a $4 coffee. "Thank you, Elena." He knew her name. The small detail startled her. He never spoke, yet he knew her name. Dominic didn't wait for her reply. He stood up, his posture instantly rigid and tense, like a spring ready to uncoil. He walked toward the window, not to leave but to look out. The street was empty. Just the usual old pickup truck driving slowly by. But Dominic wasn't looking at the truck. He was looking through it. His hands were subtly adjusted inside his pockets and his back muscles were coiled tight. The air around him suddenly felt heavy, thick with unspoken threat. He stood there still, watching the quiet, unassuming street of Williford. Every nerve ending was screaming, telling him his time was running out. He knew betrayal came with a deadline and he was already past it. He watched, tense and alert, as if expecting someone to come for him at any moment, and he was absolutely certain they would. He just didn't know when or who. The first tiny bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, but his expression remained a perfectly neutral stone. He just kept watching. The quiet river town had become his cage, and he was just waiting for the jailers to arrive. The closing shift at the riverside diner was usually a quiet, comforting ritual. The clatter of plates was replaced by the soothing whoosh of the mop bucket, and the smell of coffee mingled with the faint, clean scent of pine cleaner. Outside, the last sliver of sun had finally vanished behind the dark line of the river, leaving Williford wrapped in a velvet, moonless night. Elena, despite the long hours, always found a kind of peace in the quiet. She was methodically stacking the salt and pepper shakers, her mind drifting to her geology textbook, when she realized she wasn't entirely alone. Dominic Rourke, the stranger, was still there. He was exactly where he always was, deep in the darkest booth, a shadow among shadows. He hadn't moved since the afternoon, and the black coffee he'd been nursing must have been stone cold hours ago. Elena usually chased people out gently, but something about his stillness, his absolute lack of movement, stopped her from approaching. Instead of watching the door, he was now hunched over a small leather-bound notebook that looked like it had survived far rougher places than a diner booth. The lighting was poor, but Elena could see the intense concentration on his face. He wasn't writing words she could understand. He was scribbling strange symbols, quick loops and sharp angles, coded messages, the kind she'd only seen in bad spy movies. It made a cold knot twist in her stomach. He wasn't just a troubled loner. He was involved in something real, dangerous, and very far from the sleepy rhythm of Williford. She finished wiping the last table, feeling the weight of his presence like an extra shift she had to work. The big clock over the counter read 11:35. "Time to lock up, sir." Elena's voice was softer than usual, trying not to spook him. "I'm sorry, but we're officially closed now. I need to cash out." Dominic didn't startle, but his hand moved with lightning speed, snapping the notebook shut and slipping it into his jacket pocket. He finally looked up at her, and the intensity of his gaze was back, sharper than ever. "My apologies, Elena," he murmured, pulling out a handful of crinkled bills and dropping them onto the table. It was far too much, a gesture that screamed, "I need to buy your silence and time." "It's fine," she said quickly, nodding and grabbing the bills without counting. The 24-year-old in her wanted to demand what he was doing. The practical waitress in her wanted to just lock the door and go home. "I'm heading to the back to store the cash," she told him, trying to sound casual as she walked toward the swinging door that led to the cramped storage room and the old safe. "You can take your time getting ready." As she pushed through the door and the fluorescent light of the storage room flickered on, she paused. The safe was behind a stack of empty crates. She reached for the combination dial, but the number just wouldn't form in her head. A sudden, deep prickle of awareness ran across her skin, the kind of instinct that tells you the rules of the world have just changed. She hesitated, then slowly backed up, peeking through the narrow gap in the swinging door back into the diner. Dominic was no longer sitting. He was standing by his booth, his body language taut, his head tilted slightly, listening to something Elena couldn't hear. Then she saw them. Through the main window that faced the gravel parking lot, Elena noticed movement. Not the stumbling, familiar walk of someone drunk leaving the tavern down the road. These were silhouettes moving low and fast. They weren't walking, they were hunting. There were 3 of them, maybe 4, all dressed in dark, bulky clothes that looked too heavy for the warm night. They moved with a military kind of precision, gliding from the cover of the big oak tree toward the back entrance of the diner, their focus entirely on the building. "Thieves?" she thought wildly. But thieves usually wore masks and moved sloppily. These men were professional. They radiated a terrifying, focused purpose. In the diner, Dominic Rourke's jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. He had been listening to the subtle crunch of gravel in the parking lot for the last 5 minutes. A sound too rhythmic, too calculated. He knew the difference between a drunk civilian and men who approached a target with lethal intent. He knew instantly who they were. Not random muggers. Hitmen. And they weren't sent by a rival family. They were sent by someone who knew his movements, his habits, and the exact coordinates of his bolt hole. Someone he had once trusted with his life. The cold rush of betrayal was a familiar and bitter taste in his mouth. He didn't waste a single second. The moment the first shadow broke cover near the back utility door, Dominic moved. He covered the distance between his booth and the swinging kitchen door in 3 silent, devastating strides. He burst through the door and saw Elena, frozen in the dim light of the storage room, her hand hovering near the safe, her eyes wide with terror as she pointed frantically toward the back window. "Down. Now." Dominic's voice wasn't a shout, but a low, fierce command that cut through the silence like a scalpel. Before Elena could fully process her fear or even move, Dominic had already reached her. With surprising speed and brutal efficiency, he grabbed her by the shoulder and pulled her, low and fast, back out of the storage room and toward the main counter. He dropped them both behind the thick laminate counter, the only thing that offered a modicum of cover. The floor was cold and smelled faintly of spilled milk and Lysol. Elena was shaking violently. Who are they? What do they want?" Dominic's breathing was heavy, controlled, but his face was grim in the low light bouncing off the windows. He pressed his massive frame against her, sheltering her entirely. "Doesn't matter," he whispered, his voice startlingly close to her ear. It was the voice of a man in absolute control of an unfolding disaster. "Just stay low. Don't make a sound." He took a deep, steadying breath, and then, with a surprising gentleness that completely contradicted the coiled tension of his body, he added, "Listen to me, Elena. I promise you this, no harm will come to you tonight. I won't let it." The unexpected kindness in his voice, the fierce protectiveness radiating from him, momentarily shocked Elena out of her panic. This dangerous man, the silent shadow she feared, was actively putting himself between her and the threat gathering outside. She huddled against the cold floor, the sounds of the night suddenly amplified. The low moan of the wind, the distant rush of the river, and the unmistakable chilling crunch of footsteps getting closer to the back door. Dominic, positioned just above her, slowly, deliberately, reached under the back of his jacket, his eyes fixed on the entrance. He wasn't reaching for a wallet. Elena saw the distinct, solid shape of dark steel as his hand closed around the familiar, comforting weight of his concealed weapon. The doorknob to the back entrance rattled once, loudly, then settled back into silence. The shadows had entered the building. The sudden silence after the rattling of the doorknob was more terrifying than any scream. It meant they were inside. The quiet professionals, the shadows that moved like death itself, were now sharing the air with Dominic and Elena. Behind the counter the air was cold. Elena was pressed so tightly against Dominic's side that she could feel the steady hard thump of his heart, which somehow sounded calmer than her own frantic pulse. She was trapped in the middle of a nightmare that had walked straight out of the movies and into her life. Then the kitchen door swung open with a bang, hitting the wall and shattering the quiet. The smell of pine cleaner was instantly overpowered by the harsh metallic scent of tension and gunpowder. 4 men spilled into the main diner area. They didn't walk. They flowed, each one peeling off to take up a pre-assigned position, their movements efficient and deadly. They were all tall, dressed in matching dark tactical gear that made them look less like people and more like machines built for a single violent purpose. Elena risked a quick peek over the counter edge. Her breath hitched. Each man was holding a weapon, not small handguns but long, dark rifles. They moved their eyes across the empty booths until they locked onto the figure of Dominic Rourke. "Showtime, Rourke," a voice snarled. The man who spoke was the clear leader. He was slightly broader than the others, with a face that seemed carved from granite and a cruel, satisfied smirk twisting his mouth. He walked toward the center of the room, his boots silent on the laminate floor, his rifle held perfectly steady. Dominic slowly pushed himself up from behind the counter, forcing Elena to stay low with a heavy, silent pressure from his hand on her shoulder. He stood in the open, exposed, framed by the dark, empty windows of the diner. He was one man facing 4 armed killers. Outnumbered. Elena watched from below, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the cold tiles. Dominic did the unthinkable. He didn't reach for the gun tucked into the back of his waistband. His hands remained at his sides, open as if he were simply waiting for a coffee order. He stood perfectly still, his dangerous, stormy eyes focused only on the leader. The look Dominic gave him wasn't fear or even anger. It was a searing, painful look of profound betrayal that Elena didn't yet understand. It was the look of a man staring at a ghost who should have been a brother. The leader sneered, tilting his rifle slightly. "Took you long enough to stand up, Dominic. We were starting to think the underboss had turned into a rat and couldn't be flushed out." Dominic's voice was a low growl, laced with pure disbelief. "It was always you, Marco." The name, Marco, hung in the air, thick with history and ruin. Marco laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that bounced off the stainless steel surfaces. "Who else, Dom? You thought I was content watching you inherit everything from the old man? While I cleaned up the scraps. You always had the charisma, the name. I had the brains and the stomach to do what was necessary." He took another step closer, relishing the moment. His 3 gunmen fanned out, creating a perfect, inescapable circle around Dominic, their rifles never wavering. "You've run long enough, Dominic," Marco continued, his voice dripping with venom. "Did you really think hiding in a grease pit in the middle of nowhere drinking bad coffee with a college kid would save you? We've been planning this for weeks. Every phone line, every route, every contact. You walked right into the trap. You made it too easy." Elena, pressed against the floor, felt a wave of icy terror wash over her. Weeks. This wasn't random violence. This was a sophisticated execution, and she was the only innocent witness. She glanced desperately at Dominic, pleading with her eyes for him to do something, anything. Dominic just shook his head slowly, a grim acceptance settling over his features. "You broke the code, Marco. The code was everything." "The code pays for nothing when you're dead," Marco shot back. He signaled his men with a curt nod. The clicking sound of 4 safeties being switched off echoed through the silent diner, a chilling final sound. Dominic closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second. He was outnumbered, cornered, and utterly spent. He hadn't slept properly in weeks, constantly checking over his shoulder. He knew this moment was coming. He had fought a dozen wars for his family, but he was tired of fighting his own. He stood there, accepting that this was the end. His silence spoke louder than any plea. "I'm done." He was ready to pay the ultimate price for his blind trust. Marco raised his rifle, sighting Dominic's chest. The grin on his face was purely savage. "Any last words, underboss?" Dominic opened his eyes, staring straight into the barrel of the gun, but he said nothing. He simply looked past Marco, his gaze drifting toward the small, terrified figure huddled behind the counter. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, Elena saw something truly human in his eyes. regret. Not for his life, but for the danger he had brought to her. Marco took a deliberate step back, ready to pull the trigger and end the Rourke Syndicate's brief, doomed resistance. But in that exact, frozen moment, just as Marco's finger tightened on the trigger, something entirely human and unpredictable happened behind the counter. Elena, watching Dominic's acceptance of death and hearing the chilling finality of the safety clicks, felt a sudden, explosive surge of white-hot anger replace her fear. Not fear for herself but anger at the injustice of it all. This weary, dangerous man who had just promised to protect her was about to be executed by a traitor. Her eyes darted to Dominic's hip, where his jacket had pulled back slightly, revealing the handle of his dark, heavy gun. It was right there within arm's reach, but he was choosing not to use it. He had accepted defeat. But Elena hadn't. Her mind screamed, "He won't fight, but I'm not going to watch him die." With a desperate, animalistic surge of adrenaline, Elena lunged forward, not toward the back door but straight at Dominic's exposed hip. She didn't think, she acted. Her fingers closed around the cold, textured grip of the handgun. The smooth, heavy metal felt alien and terrifying, but her grip was firm. She ripped the weapon from Dominic's holster just as Marco let out a triumphant grunt and began to squeeze his trigger. Everything slowed down. Elena popped up from behind the counter, the gun clutched awkwardly in both hands, trained blindly toward the towering shape of Marco. Her eyes were wide, not with terror but with a fierce, unexpected determination. Before Marco or any of his 3 trained gunmen could adjust their aim, before Dominic could process the sudden, impossible sound of his own weapon being drawn, and before Marco's fatal bullet could even leave the barrel, the waitress took his gun and fired. The silence was obliterated. In the split second it took for Marco's finger to finish squeezing the trigger, Elena's hands, clutching the heavy, unfamiliar gun, had moved faster. The noise of the shot was deafening, a physical blow that cracked through the heavy night air. It wasn't the clean, focused crack of a professional hit. It was a desperate, panicked boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the diner. Elena hadn't aimed at Marco. Her shot had gone high and wild, ripping through the large plate glass window right beside the front door. The shattering glass exploded outward onto the parking lot, spraying sharp diamonds of light across the gravel. But the effect was immediate and devastating. The 4 professional gunmen who were prepared for a silent execution were instantly thrown off balance by the shock of the unexpected, loud counterfire. They were professionals, yes, but they hadn't planned for resistance from a terrified civilian, especially one firing a massive .45 caliber weapon. Marco flinched violently, dropping his aim. The bullet he had intended for Dominic's chest flew harmlessly into the ceiling, ripping a strip of acoustic tile. Dominic Rourke was completely stunned. He hadn't moved an inch, still braced for death. He was ready to meet his end, ready to let go, when the sound of his own weapon being fired jerked him back to brutal reality. He spun around to face Elena, his mind reeling. The gun he carried was heavy, designed to be drawn and fired by an expert, not yanked by a young waitress. Yet there she was, trembling but steady, her eyes still locked on the gunman, smoke curling from the barrel she held in her 2 white-knuckled hands. He wasn't stunned by the gunfire, he was stunned by her. The fear was still there in her wide, dilated pupils, but beneath it was a raw, primal fearlessness. Her move hadn't been an accident. It had been an adrenaline-fueled instinct to survive, not just herself but him. He saw the sudden, sharp precision in the way she held the weapon, the perfect textbook stance. A quiet detail that simply did not belong to the nervous college kid who served him black coffee every morning. Who is she? The thought flashed through his mind, overriding the immediate danger. No ordinary waitress has that kind of grit, that kind of precise instinct. The silence only lasted a second before the ambush erupted into absolute chaos. Marco screamed, enraged by the betrayal and the interruption. "Take them down. Don't let the witnesses leave." The 3 flanking gunmen opened fire. They weren't shooting to wound, they were shooting to kill. The air instantly filled with the cracking thunder of heavy-caliber rifles. Dominic snapped back into action. His survival instincts, honed over decades of living on the knife's edge, took over. "Get down. Elena, get down," he roared, shoving her back down beneath the counter. Bullets hammered into the counter in a terrifying torrent, tearing through the laminate and splintering the wood just inches above where Elena's head had been. The coffee machines exploded in sprays of hot water and shrapnel. The walls were stitched with deep, ugly holes, and the smell of hot lead and burning wood was instantly overpowering. Dominic didn't pull his backup gun. He reached for Elena. He clamped a powerful hand around her wrist, pulling her toward the back of the diner. The storage room. Move. They moved low and fast, scrambling on hands and knees across the wet, sticky floor. Dominic used the few remaining counter sections and the tall, refrigerated dessert display case as fleeting cover. The three riflemen were pouring suppressing fire toward the front, expecting them to flee out the shattered window, but Marco realized Dominic's intention. The back. He's going for the back door. Marco yelled to his men. Dominic and Elena slid behind the swinging kitchen door just as a fresh wave of bullets tore into the stainless steel prep table. The noise inside the cramped kitchen was deafening. Every surface amplified the shattering sound of the attack. "We go out that door and we don't stop," Dominic commanded, his voice tight and urgent. He checked the old, rusted door leading to the alleyway. The lock was simple, a fragile bolt latch. "Where is your gun, Elena?" he snapped, holding the door with his shoulder. Elena, still shaking but breathing hard, looked down at her hands. The heavy handgun had fallen onto the greasy kitchen floor somewhere near the deep fryer. The thought of reaching for it again was overwhelming. I dropped it." "Doesn't matter," Dominic said, his focus already on the door. He didn't waste time on scolding or fear. "We run." He threw his weight against the latch. It groaned, and the door burst open onto the dark, litter-strewn alley. Just as they tumbled out into the cold night air, the first sound of civilization arrived. Distant at first, like a mosquito humming, then quickly growing into a sharp, wailing alarm. Police sirens. Marco and his men heard it too. Marco's plan had been a quick, clean kill, not a drawn-out shootout involving local law enforcement. He cursed loudly inside the ruined diner. "They're coming. Get the target. Forget the girl." Dominic didn't need to be told. He hauled Elena to her feet. "Run. Follow me. Now." They bolted down the narrow alleyway, the sound of the approaching sirens swelling with every panicked step. Behind them, Marco's shouts were fading, replaced by the sound of boots running inside the diner, and then the heavy, panicked thud-thud of the three gunmen scrambling toward the back door. Elena ran harder than she ever had in her life, the adrenaline finally giving way to raw panic. Dominic ran beside her, a sudden, powerful shield in the darkness. He didn't stop to look back, focusing only on the rhythm of their escape. They burst out of the alley onto a quiet side street. Dominic stopped, pressed her against the brick wall of a closed bakery and listened. The sirens were now deafeningly close, probably already pulling up to the Riverside diner. He looked down at Elena, his face smeared with soot and sweat, his earlier resignation replaced by a fierce, driving will to survive. "They can't get us now," he breathed, the words heavy with relief and a strange new energy. "But they know who you are, Elena. They know you saw their faces. You're no longer safe here." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a thick wad of cash, more money than Elena had ever seen, and shoved it into her hand. "Take this. Go home, pack one bag. Meet me at the old shipping dock, Pier 7 in 15 minutes. Don't call anyone. Don't look back. You saved my life. Now I have to save yours." He didn't wait for her answer. He simply gave her a firm, desperate look, then vanished silently into the shadows between the buildings. Elena stood alone by the bakery wall, the massive weight of the money and the sound of the rapidly approaching sirens grounding her. Her knees were shaking, but the fear was mixed with a strange, fierce pride. She, the quiet waitress, had just scattered 4 professional killers. She clutched the cash, took a final deep breath, and started running toward her apartment. The feeling of utter helplessness was gone. Hope, though terrifying, was now a driving, desperate necessity. She had accidentally stepped into a new life, and whether she liked it or not, she had to keep moving. The old Williford boathouse was nothing more than a skeletal shadow leaning over the murky river water. It smelled strongly of rot, damp wood and old river slime. The main floor was mostly collapsed, but the small, enclosed storage shack at the back offered just enough cover and darkness for 2 fugitives. Elena was still catching her breath, hunched on a crate that felt dangerously unstable. Her heart was settling into a heavy, irregular rhythm after the frantic sprint. She clutched the heavy wad of cash Dominic had given her. It felt dirty, tainted, but also necessary. Dominic Rourke was leaning against the splintered wall, not resting but listening. His eyes hadn't left the darkness outside since they arrived. The sudden, chaotic breakup of the ambush had bought them time, but he knew Marco and his men would be hunting them with rabid intensity now, especially after the police interruption. He turned toward Elena, the shadows deepening the serious lines of his face. He didn't look like a crime boss. He looked like a soldier who had just barely survived his final battle. "We have to talk," Dominic said, his voice flat and low. Elena knew what this was about. She looked away, focusing on the distant, dull glow of the town lights across the river. About what? The coffee was bad. The tip was too big. She tried to joke, but the sound was thin and weak. "Don't play games," Dominic snapped, the casual softness of his diner persona gone completely. "You just saved my life. You pulled a .45 from a professional holster, handled the recoil, and fired a precision warning shot that scattered 4 armed men. You didn't just panic and fire. You made a tactical decision. That is not the reaction of a waitress working her way through college." He pushed himself off the wall, taking a step closer. The intensity of his gaze was suffocating. "Who are you, Elena? And where did you learn to shoot like that?" Elena finally met his eyes. She felt the heavy, cold weight of a truth she had spent 7 years successfully burying. The life she'd built. The quiet diner shifts, the student loans, the geology classes. It was all about to be ripped away by one desperate, selfless shot. She sighed, a sound heavy with regret. She knew she couldn't lie to him, not now. They were linked by bloodshed and survival. "My name is Elena Ward," she began, the familiar name feeling suddenly hollow. "But the name I ran from was different. My father. He wasn't exactly a law-abiding man." She paused, gathering the strength to speak the words that terrified her most. "I grew up inside it," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "The family. Not the syndicate kind, but the rough, independent backwoods operations. They dealt in everything, but their specialty was gun running, bringing untraceable hardware up from the south into the urban areas of Canada and the States." Dominic's eyes narrowed, processing the information. A gun-running family. It explained the familiarity with the weapon, the perfect grip. It wasn't simple precision. It was training. "They used me," Elena continued, the words coming out in a rush, desperate to get the confession over with. "Not to sell, but to clean, handle, and test the merchandise. I was taught how to strip a weapon blindfolded before I learned how to drive. My father called me his asset, because I had steady hands and good eyes." The shame in her voice was palpable. Dominic said nothing, allowing her to continue. "I ran away when I was 17, she said, wrapping her arms around herself, trembling not from the cold but from the memory. "I saw him do it. My father. He tied a man up in our warehouse, someone who stole a shipment, and he executed him. Just like that. No emotion, no hesitation. He laughed afterwards." Her voice cracked. "I realized then that if I stayed I would become them. So I took whatever I had and ran as far as I could, choosing a place that felt small and boring and completely normal." She looked him dead in the eye, fierce and miserable. "I was trying to be Elena Ward, the waitress, the student. Not Elena, the gun runner's daughter." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the lapping of the river water against the dock pilings. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't judge. He simply absorbed the truth. He recognized the pain and the effort it took to carve out a new life from a violent past. He understood running. "So you're not just a waitress," Dominic finally stated, his voice now laced with a new kind of respect and urgency. "You are someone the underworld once hunted not as a target but as a valuable asset. Your father won't let that kind of skill walk away easily." "He doesn't know where I am," Elena insisted, though the conviction was starting to crack. "It's been years." "Betrayal breeds desperation," Dominic countered, shaking his head. "And your father's business will have connections that run far deeper than a simple diner in Williford. You stepping up and using that skill just put a very bright spotlight on both of us." He knew then that this wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs. They were 2 runaways linked by fate and sudden violence. Dominic pushed off the wall and walked toward the small window, scanning the parking lot again. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, the old, familiar leather coat that had been his constant companion, to check his spare clip. As his fingers traced the lining of the coat, they snagged on something small, hard, and metallic, tucked deep inside a professionally restitched seam near the collar. He pulled the object out into the faint, filtering moonlight. It was tiny, no bigger than a thumbnail, wrapped in a thin layer of tape but unmistakable. A tracking device. It wasn't a standard, bulky GPS. It was the kind of sophisticated, military-grade transmitter the syndicate itself used to monitor high-value targets. He hadn't been found by random luck or by tracing bank transactions. He had been carrying the eyes and ears of his enemy with him all along. Dominic stared at the small piece of metal, a wave of cold fury washing over him that dwarfed the earlier fear of the ambush. His composure, which had held steady through the gunfire, finally broke. "Marco didn't just know where I was," Dominic whispered, his voice trembling with a barely contained rage that was more terrifying than any shout. He realized the cold, devastating truth. "The jacket. I haven't taken this jacket off since I left the city." He looked at the tiny transmitter, then crushed it violently in his fist, the plastic casing snapping like an insect shell. "The traitor," Dominic breathed, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. "The one who betrayed me, the one who tried to have me killed. He was close enough to put this on me. Close enough to touch me. The traitor within my syndicate is closer than I ever imagined." He hadn't been betrayed by a distant rival. He had been betrayed by someone in his most intimate inner circle. The sudden raw shock of the realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him staggering against the wall. He looked at Elena, his face grim but focused. His war was no longer just about survival. It was about vengeance, and she was now his only ally. "We have to go," he said, his voice flat with lethal certainty. "We need to get to the docks before dawn. And from now on, Elena, your past is no longer buried. It's the only thing that's going to keep us alive." The old, battered speedboat sliced through the dark, wide expanse of the Mississippi River, kicking up a rooster tail of churning brown water. The boat, a relic Dominic had secured weeks ago for just this kind of emergency, was fast, quiet, and thankfully had no paperwork linking it to anyone. They were heading south, toward the bigger shipping lanes and the endless anonymity of the ocean. Dominic had the small, powerful motor humming low, his eyes fixed on the black horizon. Elena sat huddled in the bow, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the crumpled wad of cash still heavy in her pocket. The cold anger of the betrayal still radiated off Dominic like heat from a forge. He was consumed not by fear but by the relentless puzzle of who. The tracking device had confirmed a personal, close-range plant. It had to be someone from the executive council, someone who pretended to break bread with him every week. "Think," Dominic muttered, his hands firm on the wheel. "Who was with me at the office yesterday? Who had access to this jacket?" He ran through the names. Trusted capos, longtime allies, men who had promised loyalty to his father and then to him. Every face he summoned was a new source of pain. Meanwhile, Elena pulled her phone out, a small, cheap burner she used only for emergencies. She knew Marco and his men would track their real phones instantly. She checked the messages, the screen illuminated weakly beneath the edge of her jacket. Just then her phone pinged, signaling an incoming message. The notification was from an unknown number, encrypted with a sequence of symbols that instantly felt chillingly familiar. It was the kind of encryption her father's operation used to ensure messages weren't intercepted by the authorities or rivals. She opened it with trembling fingers. The message was short, brutal, and utterly unbelievable. "They know you're with him. Get off the river now. I can cover you but not him. We need to call the secure line." It wasn't the urgency of the text that shocked her. It was the name signed at the bottom. The name she had mourned, the name that belonged to a ghost. "See." Elena's breath hitched, a silent, painful gasp. Her eyes blurred with sudden, overwhelming emotion. She read the name again, tracing the letter with a shaky finger. "Caleb," she whispered, the name a painful mix of disbelief and longing. "It can't be." Dominic immediately killed the engine, the sudden silence of the river night deafening. "What did you say?" he demanded, spinning the wheel around to face her. "What is it?" Elena stared at the phone, tears finally streaming down her cheeks, not of fear but of profound, shocking grief and hope. "My brother," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "My older brother, Caleb Ward. He was in the family business. When I ran, I assumed he was dead or arrested. I haven't heard from him in 7 years. But this is his encrypted line. This is him." She shoved the phone toward Dominic. He's alive, Dominic. My brother is alive. Dominic took the phone, his cold, professional eyes scanning the message. He instantly recognized the encryption cipher. It was high-grade, expensive, and belonged to only a few syndicates on the coast. But it wasn't the Rourke syndicate's code. He looked from the message back to Elena, and his expression hardened from shock into a chilling final certainty. The truth of the night, the identity of the betrayer, and the fate of her brother all slammed into place. He's alive, Elena, Dominic confirmed, handing the phone back to her, but he's not your little brother anymore. He's not running the family hardware store. He's running the competition. He grabbed the wheel, the motor roaring back to life as he steered them sharply toward the cover of a heavily wooded inlet. I've been trying to figure out who among my men was close enough to plant the bug, Dominic explained, his voice low and intense over the wind. I was looking at my friends. But I should have been looking at my enemies. He took a deep breath, delivering the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Your brother, Caleb Ward, is now the right-hand man to Vince Moresi, the mafia boss of the Moresi family. Vince is the one who's been trying to take over our territory for years. He's powerful, ruthless, and he wants me eliminated so he can move on the city with no resistance. Elena stared at him, the wind stealing the air from her lungs. Moresi? You mean, the people who sent Marco and the gunmen were working for Moresi? And my brother is working for him? Marco wasn't one of my men, Elena, Dominic said, his gaze fixed on the river ahead. He was a mercenary paid by Moresi. And who is better placed to pay and organize a strike against me than Moresi's most trusted second-in-command? Your brother knows how I operate. He knows my weak points. He knows my habits. He probably knew about the Riverside Diner too from your father's old contacts. The terrible reality was complete. Elena had risked her life to save a man who was now being hunted by her long-lost, presumed dead brother. Caleb wasn't calling to help her escape a distant gang. He was calling to recruit her and betray the man she had just pulled from the jaws of death. Elena felt a terrible wrenching pain in her chest. She had finally found the brother she had mourned for 7 long years, but he had found her as a foot soldier for the enemy. She was utterly torn. On one side was Caleb, her flesh and blood, a link to the family she hated but couldn't forget, offering her a way out of the immediate danger. On the other was Dominic, the dangerous stranger whose life she had just saved, the one who had promised her protection with surprising, genuine gentleness. She had stood up to killers for him. He's asking me to leave you, Elena whispered, her voice raw with conflict. Dominic didn't look at her. He kept the boat moving, hugging the shoreline. I know, he said simply. And I know how much that choice hurts you. But Elena, look at what you did in that diner. You chose justice over fear. You risked everything for the right thing even when the odds were 4 against 1. He finally slowed the boat and cut the engine near a small hidden break in the trees. He turned to face her, his eyes holding a profound, desperate plea. Vince Moresi wants to be the kind of monster your father was, but bigger. Your brother is helping him. And you risked everything to stop it. Now you have to make a final choice. Go with the man who ran from that violence or go back into the bloodline you ran from. He gave her a beat to absorb the crushing weight of her dilemma. Call him back, Elena, Dominic instructed, his voice now firm, authoritative yet strangely gentle. Tell him you're safe. But tell him you're not coming alone. We need to know where he is. We need to know who the real traitor is within my council. We need to turn this around. You are the only person he trusts. You are our only way in. Elena looked down at the phone in her hand, then at the strong, determined face of the man she had unexpectedly saved. The hope of seeing her brother was intoxicating, but the shame of his betrayal was a bitter antidote. She gripped the phone tightly, her mind made up in a flash of fierce resolve. She wouldn't run back to the bloodline. She wouldn't abandon the man she saved. She would face the truth of her brother head-on. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pressed the dial button on the burner phone, calling the encrypted line her long-lost brother had provided. She was about to step back into the terrifying world she had spent years escaping, but this time she was doing it on her own terms and she wasn't alone. The meeting point was an abandoned warehouse deep within the Canadian side of the Great Lakes shipping ports, a place cold enough to freeze the breath in your lungs and remote enough to hide any evidence of violence. Dominic had set up the meet through an old neutral contact, using Elena's conversation with Caleb as bait. They needed to know Moressi's next move, and Dominic, despite his reputation, chose to talk first. He still believed in a code even among thieves. Elena was hidden in a dark, high-up catwalk, the kind of spot where she could see everything but remain unseen. She was carrying the burner phone, recording everything. Her heart hammered against her ribs, the noise amplified in the echoing silence of the steel structure. Her brother Caleb was down there, standing right next to Vince Moressi. Moressi was older than Dominic, dressed in a tailored, expensive suit that looked out of place against the industrial grime. He carried himself with a smug, quiet authority. Caleb, Elena's brother, stood stiffly at his side. A perfect soldier, his face an emotionless mask, his eyes sharp and cautious. He looked like the ghost she had mourned, but harder, colder. Dominic stood alone, exposed in the center of the vast concrete floor. "Vince," Dominic began, his voice surprisingly calm. "We've always kept our territories separate. I'm here to offer you an olive branch. Stop this war or the bloodshed will wipe both of us out." Vince Moressi smiled, a slow, predatory showing of teeth. "Oh, Dominic. Always the poet. You think I came all this way to talk about territory?" He gestured to the warehouse around them with dismissive contempt. "Your father's land is fine, but I'm looking beyond the city limits now. I'm looking at something far more profitable." The negotiations, as Dominic predicted, went terribly wrong. "You wanted me dead because I know what you're really moving," Dominic stated, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. He looked Moressi right in the eye. "It's not just guns and drugs anymore, is it, Vince? It's people." The air in the warehouse instantly turned frigid. Moressi's smile vanished. He took a slow, deliberate step toward Dominic. "You really couldn't mind your own business, could you, Dom? You had to go sticking your righteous nose where it didn't belong." Vince then revealed the horrifying truth that made Dominic a target. "Yes," Vince admitted, his voice barely a hiss. "We run a pipeline. Young, vulnerable kids. Mostly runaways, easy to scoop up from border towns. We move them across the country, selling them off to the highest bidders." He paused, his eyes gleaming with sick pride. "It's a silent empire, Dom. Zero risk, maximum reward. And you, little underboss, found the ledger." Dominic's face was a mask of cold fury. "You're a monster, Vince. We dealt in vice, not in destroying children." "Nonsense," Moressi scoffed. "And you know what the best part is? The girls, they're all around Elena's age. 19, 20, 24. Sweet, ripe, and easy to disappear." Up on the catwalk, Elena froze. The horror of the conversation, the people, the kidnapped teens, girls exactly her age, was a physical blow. The betrayal of the criminal code was one thing, but this was pure evil. It was the same kind of soulless violence she had run from 7 years ago, only magnified 1,000 times. She gripped the railing, her stomach twisting. She realized then, the conflict was no longer about Dominic's life or her brother's safety. The only way to stop Vince was to expose the truth, to get the ledger and bring the whole rotten operation down, even if it meant confronting Caleb and facing her own violent past head-on. Vince laughed, a chilling, triumphant sound that echoed through the empty space. "But now you know and now you die. You should have minded your territory, Dominic." Moressi lifted his hand, signaling his own gunmen, who emerged from the shadows to surround Dominic. Dominic knew this was the end of the negotiation. "And as for your little friend," Moressi added, waving dismissively toward the catwalk where Elena was hiding, "don't worry. She's not going anywhere. Caleb will make sure of that." Dominic looked at Caleb, hatred burning in his eyes. "You would let him do this, Caleb? You would sell your soul for this animal?" It was at that moment the emotional twist landed hard. Vince smiled again, but this time, it was a nasty, condescending gesture of absolute power. "Oh, Dominic. Caleb isn't here because he wants to be. He's here because he owes me everything." Moressi casually dropped a bombshell that shattered Elena's entire foundation. "Did you think I was stupid enough to let a valuable asset like the ward boy die? His pathetic father let him get arrested during a botched gun run, but I pulled the strings. I paid the right judges. I got him out." Moressi's voice was light, recounting a transaction, not a rescue. He tapped Caleb on the shoulder. "I faked your brother's death, Elena. I made him owe me. I put him through a few years of painful loyalty training and now he's my right hand. He doesn't betray me because he has nothing left but me. He stays loyal or he goes back to prison or maybe he finds out what happens when you cross Vince Moresi. Caleb flinched, a tiny, almost invisible movement, but it was enough. The mask slipped for a painful second, and Elena saw the deep, hopeless misery in her brother's eyes. He wasn't a traitor out of malice. He was a slave out of desperation. Elena felt the agonizing realization settle in her heart. Her brother was alive, but he was trapped, owned by the very monster Dominic was trying to fight. "You're pathetic, Vince," Dominic spat out, the words laced with profound disgust. "You use everyone. Even the dead." "It's called efficiency," Moresi corrected, raising his hand again to signal the shooters. "Goodbye, Dominic." Up on the catwalk, Elena didn't hesitate. Her fear of Caleb's forced life and her fierce need to protect the kidnapped girls overruled everything else. She wasn't aiming to kill, she was aiming for chaos. She aimed the burner phone toward the floor, not as a projectile but as a distraction. With a loud, decisive throw, Elena hurled the phone toward the center of the concrete floor. It shattered with a sharp, echoing crack, the sudden noise drawing every gunman's attention for a precious split second. "The ledger!" Elena yelled down, her voice amplified and distorted by the steel rafters, aiming to create maximum confusion. "He keeps the ledger in the safe." Moresi and his men flinched, their heads snapping toward the unexpected voice and the impossible claim. Caleb, however, looked straight up to the catwalk, his face a sudden portrait of agony and realization. Dominic used the exact moment of confusion. He didn't run. He lunged toward Moresi, using his own body as a battering ram, shoving the surprised boss back against a stack of wooden crates and creating a shield between himself and the circling gunmen. The warehouse erupted in gunfire, the shots deafening as the men tried to hit Dominic without hitting their boss. The war had just gone loud, bloody, and entirely personal. The warehouse had been a thunderous mess of broken crates, splintered wood, and deafening gunfire. Dominic, using Vince Moresi as a human shield, managed to break free and retreat toward the dark maze of storage containers. Elena, after throwing the phone and yelling the distraction, scrambled down from the catwalk, her movements guided by the frantic memory of the warehouse layout. They converged in a tight, filthy service corridor. Dominic was breathing hard, a graze bleeding across his shoulder, but he was furious and alive. Before he could speak, a shadow detached itself from the gloom ahead. It was Caleb Ward. He was alone, his gun held loosely at his side, his face a desolate landscape of guilt and pain. He blocked their only exit. "Caleb," Elena whispered, the name catching in her throat. Seeing him up close, seeing the man he had become, hardened, distant, but still bearing the familiar features of her lost brother, was a profound, agonizing moment. Dominic immediately raised his weapon. "Stand down, Ward. This is your last chance." Caleb didn't move, but his eyes were fixed entirely on Elena. He looked like a man standing on a broken cliff edge ready to fall. "Elena, listen to me," Caleb pleaded, his voice rough and laced with years of suppressed misery. "Go. Go now. Vince is furious. He'll burn this whole port down to get Dominic. I can still cover your escape, but you have to leave him here." "I won't leave him," Elena said, stepping out from behind Dominic's protection, forcing herself to be brave. "And I won't go with you, Caleb. Not for Vince. Not for a human trafficker." Caleb flinched violently at the word trafficker. It was clear the monstrous nature of Moresi's business was a weight on his conscience. "You don't understand, Elle," Caleb insisted, his voice thick with desperation. "Vince didn't just save me from prison. He owns me. He put me through a kind of hell that would make prison look like a holiday. He manipulated me for years, making me believe he was the only power that could keep me alive. He threatened to go after you, after Mom, after anyone I ever loved. He took everything and replaced it with loyalty or else." He lowered his weapon slightly, his hands trembling. "Betraying Vince doesn't mean jail time, Elena. It means certain slow death. He doesn't just kill traitors, he makes them disappear in pieces. I have no choice." Dominic stepped forward, trying to appeal to the last shred of the loyal man Caleb must have once been. "You do have a choice, Caleb," Dominic argued, keeping his gun steady. "Vince is finished. The police sirens are coming, the ports are locked down. Give us the ledger, give us the girls, and we can bury him. I can protect you. My syndicate can shelter you." "Your syndicate is fractured, Dominic," Caleb countered bitterly. And you're a dead man walking. I know that. Vince knows that. I am not trading one executioner for another. It was a true statement, and Dominic couldn't argue the logic of a lifetime spent in the underworld. Elena knew that logic and threats wouldn't work. The only thing left was the truth of their shared history, the raw, bleeding link of bloodline. She took another step toward her brother, tears finally streaming down her face, glistening in the faint light of the corridor. "Do you remember why I ran, Caleb?" she asked, her voice cracking with the emotional weight of 7 years. "It wasn't just father executing that man. It was the moment I realized we were losing you, too. You used to read me bedtime stories. You helped me with my homework. You were the only good thing left in that terrible house." She reached out her hand, a simple, non-threatening gesture of love. "And now you're letting another monster own you. You are alive, Caleb. You're not in prison. You're not dead. But you're choosing to be Moressi's slave and help him destroy other people's children. Other girls who are exactly the age I was when I ran to save myself. Is that what I ran away for? To find out the man I mourned is doing the monster's bidding?" The powerful, emotional confrontation landed hard. Caleb's composure finally shattered. His face crumpled and tears welled up in his own eyes, the first genuine human emotion Elena had seen from him. He looked from Elena, the embodiment of his lost innocence, to Dominic, the embodiment of the war he couldn't win, and then down at the floor, confronting the terrifying truth of his stolen life. "I couldn't live with the guilt, Elena," Caleb whispered, his voice broken. "I tried to be clean. But Vince. He breaks you down until you only see him." He lifted his head, his decision made in the excruciating intersection of desperation and love. He didn't drop his gun, but he moved it away from Dominic, turning his back on his criminal loyalty. "The ledger is at Vince's main offshore holding location," Caleb said quickly, his voice regaining a professional edge, but now focused on saving lives. "It's the old Kingfisher dock facility, down by the Bayou coast. The shipment, the girls, they're moving tonight by boat. You have less than 4 hours." Dominic nodded, absorbing the crucial information. "But I have one condition," Caleb continued, his eyes meeting Dominic's, the intensity of a desperate man making a final, terrifying deal. He looked back at Elena, his face twisted with the fear of inevitable reprisal. "Vince won't let this go. He'll know it was me. He'll come after me with everything he has." Caleb took a deep, shuddering breath, then spoke the words that bound them forever. "If Vince comes after me, Dominic, you have to swear on your life that you will protect Elena. She stays out of this war. She gets to have the normal life she ran for. Promise me." Dominic looked at the man who had just betrayed his boss to save his sister and stop a horrific crime. He saw the genuine, self-sacrificing love beneath the hardened shell. "I promise you, Caleb," Dominic stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "I will die before any harm comes to Elena. She is under my protection no matter what happens to you." Caleb nodded once, a look of profound relief and sorrow settling on his face. He quickly pulled a small, heavy encryption key from his jacket pocket, the physical access to the ledger. He tossed it to Dominic. "Go," he urged them, pushing them toward the side exit. "I'll buy you time. I'll make sure Vince thinks you went toward the river." Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed Dominic's arm, pulling him toward the exit, but she stopped and looked back at her brother, who was already turning away, preparing to face his fate. "I love you, Caleb," she cried out. Caleb paused but didn't look back. "I love you too, El. Now go and never look back." They left Caleb standing alone in the dark corridor, knowing they were leaving him to a near-certain violent end. But they left with the location and the key, the tools they needed to bring Moressi's horrific empire crashing down and save the innocent girls before time ran out. The Kingfisher dock facility was exactly what Dominic expected. A decaying industrial complex tucked deep within the Bayou coast, perfect for moving illegal cargo, including human beings, without attracting attention. It was a sprawling, silent fortress guarded by professional thugs. They had less than 4 hours before the girls were moved and the ledger vanished. Dominic had immediately reached out to the few members of the Rourke syndicate he still trusted, old loyal enforcers who knew the meaning of the code, men who were loyal to the family, not just the money. They were lean, efficient, and ready for war. "This isn't about territory," Dominic told his 4 remaining grim-faced loyalists as they approached the compound in the dead of night. "It's about wiping out a plague. We move fast, we move silent. We hit the main office for the ledger, then we secure the holding cells. As the small team prepared to launch the covert strike, Dominic turned to Elena, who was standing beside him in the shadows, her jacket zipped tight, her eyes burning with resolve. "Elena," Dominic said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You have the burner phone. You stay at the rendezvous point. If we don't report in 30 minutes, you call the FBI tip line with the ledger details. You promised Caleb you'd stay safe." "No," Elena replied, her voice steady and resolute. She didn't shout or argue, she simply refused. "You promised Caleb you would protect me. I'm not staying behind, Dominic. I know this compound setup. I know how to move weapons. And most importantly, those are girls my age in there. I'm not waiting for a phone call while they suffer." She looked him straight in the eye, the unwavering determination of the gunrunner's daughter overriding the fear of the college student. Dominic stared at her for a long moment, seeing not the vulnerable waitress, but the fierce, survival-driven woman who had shot his gun and pulled him out of a death trap. He knew he couldn't convince her, and frankly her unique skill set, the intimate, silent knowledge of an illicit operation, was too valuable to ignore. "Fine," he conceded, frustration giving way to reluctant respect. "But you stay low, you cover the rear, and you only move when I tell you." He handed her a small, lightweight automatic handgun. "Your backup. My life depends on you." Elena nodded, gripping the familiar cold steel. "Yours and theirs." The team split up, slipping through the perimeter fence like ghosts. Elena moved with an uncanny, practiced grace. She knew exactly where the shadow lines were longest, where the gravel was quietest. When they encountered the first two perimeter guards, Dominic and his men moved to neutralize them quickly, but it was Elena who provided the crucial advantage. She used her childhood training to outmaneuver Vince's men. Seeing a guard move toward a blind spot, she didn't shoot. Instead, she grabbed a loose coil of wire, expertly throwing it across the guard's path just as he passed a large running ventilation unit. The wire snagged the guard's foot, sending him sprawling into the loud ventilation fan with a crash that masked the sound of Dominic's team subduing his partner. "Efficient," Dominic whispered, glancing at her with renewed astonishment. The massive shootout erupted when they reached the main central storage shed, where the holding cells were located. They were instantly ambushed by a dozen of Moressi's armed enforcers. The darkness was torn apart by muzzle flashes and the roar of heavy gunfire. Dominic and his men fought with ruthless speed and precision, clearing a path toward the main office. Elena, positioned behind a stack of giant oil drums, provided vital covering fire, her aim steady despite the chaos. She targeted hands, radios, and knees, not killing but neutralizing the immediate threat, allowing Dominic's team to advance. As the fight raged, Dominic reached the relative safety of the office door. He threw himself against the thick steel door, trying to force it open. Suddenly, a voice, calm and unervingly familiar, called out from behind a row of metal shelves. "It's no use, Dom. The lock is keyed to Moressi's biometric access." Dominic froze. He knew that voice. It was deep, confident, and belonged to someone he trusted implicitly. He spun around, his weapon raised, just as a figure stepped into the light filtering through the bullet-riddled windows. The shocking twist landed hard. The man standing there, holding a silenced handgun pointed directly at Dominic, was Mason Hale. Mason Hale was Dominic's long-trusted lieutenant, a man who had been at Dominic's side since their teenage years, a key member of the Rourke Syndicate's inner circle, and the man Dominic had counted on to run the territory in his absence. "Mason," Dominic choked out, lowering his weapon slightly in pure raw disbelief. "It was you. You planted the bug? You fed him the location of the diner." Mason smiled, a cold, utterly empty expression that confirmed his complete lack of conscience. "Of course it was me, Dom. Who else would have access to your personal effects? Who else could clear the roads for Moressi's muscle? I've been feeding Vince information for months." "But why?" Dominic's voice was heavy with the weight of the ultimate betrayal. "I made you rich. I trusted you with my life. You made me a lieutenant," Mason sneered, adjusting his aim. "Vince is going to make me a boss. You always had the family name, the blood. I had the smarts, the ambition. You were just too focused on the code to see the real opportunity. Once Moresi takes over, I get your entire territory, Dom. All the profit, none of the obsolete Rourke rules." Mason had the advantage. He was fresh, concealed, and held a clear line of sight. Just as Mason tightened his finger on the trigger, a series of quick, sharp shots rang out from the periphery. Not Dominic's gun and not the heavy fire from Moressi's remaining thugs. It was Elena. Having heard the betrayal and seeing the clear threat, Elena moved from her cover and fired 3 rapid shots. She didn't aim for Mason, but for the heavy overhead pulley system that ran along the ceiling above him. The ancient metal connections snapped and a heavy cargo chain, thick and rusty, dropped with a screaming whoosh. The chain slammed down on Mason's gun arm and shoulder with a sickening thud, forcing a yell of pain from the traitor and sending his silenced weapon skittering across the floor. Dominic didn't wait. He closed the distance in a rush, landing a brutal, vengeful blow to Mason's jaw, sending his lieutenant crashing against the steel door. Mason was stunned, spitting blood and disbelief. "You broke the code, Mason," Dominic snarled, retrieving the fallen weapon and securing Mason. With the traitor subdued and the ledger access compromised, Dominic smashed the panel beside the door. It required a special code, but Caleb's encryption key, which was the physical drive containing the master key, overrode the system. The steel door hissed open, revealing the horrific truth. A small, dark room, where nearly 24 terrified teenage girls were huddled together, silently praying. The stench of fear and confinement was overwhelming. Elena rushed in, dropping her gun to the ground, her face wet with relief and fury. "It's over," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You're safe. We're getting you out of here." The war wasn't over yet, but the innocent were saved. The traitor was exposed and Dominic and Elena had just secured the evidence needed to sink Vince Moresi forever. The Kingfisher Dock compound was now a wreck. The sirens had finally arrived, a distant wail that meant law enforcement was struggling through the bayou roads. But before they got there, one final brutal piece of business remained. Vince Moresi. Dominic had secured Mason Hale and ensured the girls were moved to a safe location under the watch of his most loyal men. He found Moresi in his high-up private office, overlooking the dock. Vince, having realized his entire empire was crumbling, was trying to shred the last incriminating documents. The office was lavishly appointed, a sickening contrast to the cramped cell where the girls were kept. As Dominic entered, gun raised, the air was thick with the scent of fear and burning paper. "It's over, Vince," Dominic said, his voice quiet, filled with cold, justified rage. "The ledger is secured. Your operation is exposed. The girls are safe." Moresi spun around, his face purple with fury. "You fool. You threw away a dynasty for sentiment. You think the police can stop me? I'll buy them all off just like I bought your pathetic little friend." Suddenly, the door burst open and Mason Hale, having escaped his loose restraints and grabbed his dropped weapon, lunged into the room. He was driven by pure, desperate vengeance, determined to finish his betrayal. Mason ignored Moresi and focused entirely on his former boss. "You're dead, Dominic. I earned my spot." The situation was instantly a tense standoff. Mason had the clear shot at Dominic's back, while Dominic's attention was split between the armed boss and the traitor. "Stay back, Elena," Dominic roared, realizing she had followed him up the stairs. Mason raised his gun, his eyes burning with lethal intent, ready to execute his former friend and secure his new empire. But just as Mason's finger began to squeeze the trigger, a single shot rang out. It wasn't Dominic. It was the sharp, focused crack of a small-caliber weapon, fired with devastating precision from the doorway. The bullet struck Mason Hale in the precise center of his wrist, shattering the bones and forcing a scream of pure agony from the traitor. His gun clattered harmlessly to the floor. Elena took the shot. She had seen the whole sequence unfold, the desperate lunge, the deadly aim, the pure intent. And she reacted not with fear, but with the cold, necessary discipline of the gunrunner's daughter, saving Dominic the exact same way she saved him in the diner. But this time her aim was deliberate and flawless. Dominic didn't hesitate. With Mason neutralized and crying out on the floor, he shifted his full attention back to Vince Moresi. Vince, seeing his last loyal soldier incapacitated, panicked. He scrambled backward, pulling a hidden dagger from his boot. "I will bury you," Moresi shrieked, lunging forward in a final, frantic attack. Dominic met the attack head-on. He didn't fire, he deflected. He had always been the superior fighter, the better tactician. He sidestepped the desperate lunge, brought his elbow down sharply on Moressi's armed hand, and then delivered a single focused lethal blow. Dominic killed Vince, not out of vengeance but out of necessity, putting an end to the nightmare he ran, and ensuring justice for every life he destroyed. Vince Moresi fell silent and still. The silence in the office, after the cacophony of the war below, was absolute. Dominic looked from the dead crime boss to the wounded traitor, and then finally to Elena, who stood by the door, the small gun still smoking slightly in her hands. "You never miss, do you, Elena?" Dominic murmured, the words heavy with respect, relief and awe. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place quickly. The local police, arriving in force, were overwhelmed by the scene. Dominic, clean of the killing of Vince, a clear act of self-defense against a known criminal, turned over Mason Hale and most crucially the ledger and the key. The evidence was irrefutable. The Moresi trafficking ring was dismantled forever. The victory was complete, but the most important task remained. Caleb. Dominic's loyalists found Caleb, badly beaten and hidden in a secure closet after diverting Moresi's immediate men. He was bruised and broken but alive. Dominic personally ensured Caleb was treated by a private doctor and then discreetly moved to a safe location far away from the authorities, fulfilling his promise. Caleb was finally free. Free from Moresi's servitude and free from the guilt, able to finally live the life his sister had risked everything for. A few weeks later, Dominic and Elena were standing on a quiet balcony overlooking the vast, cold sweep of Lake Ontario. Dominic had spent the time coordinating the cleanup, ensuring the Rourke Syndicate was purged of any remaining corruption and positioning it to become a legitimate humanitarian organization, a promise he had made to himself when he saw what Moresi had done. Elena was dressed in civilian clothes again, looking healthier but fundamentally changed. She wasn't the timid waitress anymore. Dominic turned to her, his intense eyes softening with genuine affection. "The war is over, Elena. Vince is gone, the girls are safe, and Caleb is building a new life. And Mason, well, he's where he belongs. You did all of that." He walked over to her, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, heavy silver key, the key to a new legitimate office building in Toronto that would house the new Rourke Security Group. Dominic offered Elena a place in his syndicate. "I need a security advisor," he said, his voice earnest. "Someone to oversee the logistics, ensure the books are clean and manage the genuine assets. It's a clean slate, a legitimate business. But more than that, I need someone I can trust. I have met a lot of ruthless, loyal people, Elena, but I have never met anyone with your combination of fierce morals and devastating skill." He gently placed the key in her hand. "I need you not as a soldier but as my conscience. As my partner. Someone who knows when to draw the line. Someone who knows what's worth fighting for." He looked at her, his expression raw and hopeful. "You can take the money, go back to Williford and finish college. You earned that life. But you can also choose this one. A life where you use that strength, that precision to ensure justice and hope win every time. A life with me." Elena held the key, its coolness anchoring her. She looked out at the lights of the city, a vast, unpredictable world of possibility. She thought of the smell of the riverside diner, the safety of the normal, simple life. And then she remembered the sound of the rifle bolts clicking, the feel of the cold gun in her hand, the sight of Caleb's trapped desperation, and the faces of the terrified, rescued girls. She realized she couldn't simply go back to serving coffee. She had seen too much, done too much. Her past wasn't a burden anymore. It was a necessary power. A slow, genuine smile, the kind that truly reached her eyes, spread across her face. The look of sadness was gone, replaced by unwavering purpose. "The coffee in Toronto is probably better than Williford's," she said, her voice steady and clear. She turned the key over in her palm, accepting the dangerous, beautiful future he offered. "But I'll take the job, Dominic. Someone needs to make sure the underboss keeps his promises." Dominic laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened relief and happiness. He reached out and gently took her hand, pulling her into a warm, heartfelt embrace. Hope, justice, and love had won. Elena had traded her apron for a destiny she never asked for, embracing the dangerous man who had taught her that running wasn't the only way to survive. She stepped back into the dangerous life she once swore she'd left behind, but this time she was a protector, standing on the side of light, ready to build a new world alongside the man she had saved, leaving the audience with the heartwarming certainty that even in the darkest corners of life, courage and love can always prevail. We have come to the end of the story. Thank you for watching to the end. Share your opinion about this story in the comments below. I like getting feedback from my audience. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our heartwarming stories.